Okay, so in this video we're going to be dealing with details like the collar and clothing and how they relate to the neckline and the head. And as you can see, I've already sketched in details of where I want the collar to be. This is the collar of his shirt, and I've sketched it to where it's going to open up so I know where I want the button placket to be and where I want a slight opening where that top button is unbuttoned. Also, I have here the lines of a coat that he's wearing, a lab coat that he would wear to teach and paint in. And when you're planning things like clothing, you want to remember a couple things. One is if you do have layers like this, where you've got a shirt collar that's going to come over a jacket or a blazer or a sweater, you want to apply the details for the piece of clothing that's going to be underneath that before you put the collar and other details on top of that. It's just going to make your life easier. Another thing to remember is that when you're dealing with a piece of clothing, you don't necessarily need to do something where you've got the entire shoulder and the back and everything covered with an entire slab of cloth. Unless you're dealing with something very thick, it's easier just to have the collars coming away, the lapels on top of the surface of the slab of clay that you already have there, and it's going to give the illusion of clothing over that. So I wouldn't apply another slab of clay over there. I'm just going to work on the lapels and the collar, probably the shirt placket there as the details that come away from the surface here. Okay, so I have already rolled out a lot of thin pieces of clay. It's probably about a quarter of an inch, maybe a little thinner. And I've rolled out a lot of them. I've got about 4 pieces, about roughly the same size. And that's to give me a lot of pieces of clay that I can piece together. And so I'm not rolling out clay as I go. So that'll give you a lot of flexibility. So the lapel for the lab coat is going to be a little thinner than a regular blazer. There's a little notch, I believe, right about there. Okay. And then with a collar, they tend to get a little more narrow and bunched up as they go around the back of your neck and shoulders there. So it's not going to be one same width piece of clay as it goes in the back. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to cut a skinnier strip of clay, close to the proportions of what I've sketched there, out of my slab of clay. I'm going to do this in sections so I'm able to turn the pieces of clay as they go around the back of the neck. I'm not just taking one piece of clay and draping it around like a scarf and trying to pat it into shape. I'm doing the front first, and then I'll go around the sides and the back of the neck there. Okay, so I've got a piece of clay. Looks pretty good. I like those proportions. Okay, I have a little extra down here I can trim. Okay. So since this is going to be the mirror image of this, see, if you took this piece of clay and reversed it and brought it over here, you'd have the piece that you needed over here. So I'm going to take this piece of clay and I'm going to trace it by rotating it on another piece of slab. Okay, so I've taken this piece of clay from over here. Take that and I'm going to put it upside down, face down on another fresh slab of clay. I'm going to trace that to give myself the mirror image. So I've got the proportions, the length, the size, and the shape that I want. And let that rest on there. Cut out this other piece. Okay, so cut that out. Put that right there. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to slice off the little extra at the bottom there. Okay, so those seem still a little thick to me at the edge here, so I'm not going to thin the whole thing. I'm going to take my fingers and just pinch the edge to give that a more naturalistic look, make it look a little more like cotton cloth instead of super thick sweater material. Okay, that'll lay that down, make it look a little more naturalistic, a little more organic. Okay, get rid of the angles where I cut it. Made kind of a bevel that I don't really need. Okay. I'm going to leave it a little thicker in here on the inside just because that's where the fabric would fold over, so it is going to be a little thicker there. But the edges here, it's going to be a little thinner. Okay. Do the same thing on this side. Okay. Soften my cut mark. It's a little more like fabric. Okay. There we go. Okay, that's pretty nice. And I'm going to take some thinner pieces of clay. I'm going to place them across the back here. So they're not quite as wide. Let's see. Okay. Okay, kind of like that, the way that looks. Okay. There we go. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make that a little skinnier at the edges so it doesn't look quite so dense, this material. Okay. That's why it's good to work from photographs. It kind of gives you a sense of the abstract nature of the details that you're working on. Sometimes our minds make things up that aren't really there. Okay, so now we're going to slip and score these on. Make sure to use a lot of slip on here just because we've got a piece of clay that's been drying a little bit. I've been keeping it fairly moist, but it's slightly more leather hard than the clay that obviously we're putting on there that's fresh out of the bag, so we want to make sure we've got a good attachment there. We'll let those dry slowly because we don't want our thinner pieces of clay to delaminate themselves completely off the base as they're drying. So we will wrap these as soon as we have attached those on there to give them a chance to dry to the same rate as the base piece. Okay. Go ahead, And I'm going to start at the bottom there, and I'm going to gently pat and tap this upwards. Okay. Make sure I work out any air pockets in that slip layer so it doesn't pop off. Okay. And I'm just attaching in the center there and towards the inside edge. I'm not laminating this edge down just because I want to give that a little lift off the surface of the clothing there. Okay, makes it a little more naturalistic looking, not so much like the collar's been starched down to the base of the garment there. Okay, most people have little wrinkles and folds, places where the fabric kind of curls. Okay. Do the same thing on this side, starting from the bottom, just kind of pressing in the center towards the outside, but not all the way to the outside. Okay. It's kind of like drawing with your fingers while also slipping on your piece. It's nice to work under a light like this because you can really see where the shadow catches on angles of things. If things look very beveled or unnatural, you can kind of come in and soften that with your finger. Pull that just out a little more, make it a little thinner. Okay. We've got our piece in the back here, and I've made this really uneven looking because when your collar kind of twists in the back there, it's very rare for them to look very crisp. And this was a very rumpled looking garment worn to keep paint off clothing. So it's okay if things look a little twisted and rumpled and okay. Okay, so once again I'm coming in, just gonna blend those a little together. Okay. There we go. Thin that out just a bit more there. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we've got the lab coat collar on there. So now we're going to put the shirt collar on there, and that is kind of an Oxford shirt that has more of a bend. So we're actually going to take a piece of clay and bend it a little bit to give that angle as the collar comes down. Remember, the angle of collars sort of depends on the period of time that you are working with in your subject's clothing. So the longer you make the collar points, the more your subject can look like they were from the 1970s or I don't know, some era where they had really long collars. If you're doing someone from the Renaissance and you've got like a lacy collar, you know, they've had those very Shakespearean. You can do those with clay. It's a little trickier, but you can do it. Okay, so I'm making a piece. It's kind of, let's see, I guess it's a parallelogram. It's a good way to say it. Okay. So I'll probably cut off a little bit of this, but I've got this piece. It's kind of angle comes forward a little more. The rest of it's pretty much a triangle, a little longer at the bottom there. So I'm going to thin out those edges just the way I did on the lab coat. Okay. So the reason I'm just thinning out the edges and not the whole piece is because if I make this clay too thin and I'm doing a lot of bending, that can cause breakage, and when it's drying it can make it really fragile. So to make something look thin, you just give it kind of the illusion of being a thinner piece of clay by just thinning out the edges there. Okay. So I am going to take this piece of clay from the top here, and I'm going to gently fold that down a little bit. Okay. There we go. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so that's fairly large. We don't need it to be that large, but you can see where we got our angle going here. So I'm going to look at that in the front. I'm going to see just how much I need and what I need to cut off. Okay, so I don't want the collar to come down that much, so I'm going to just cut along here. I'm going to bring it back, make it a lot thinner back here. Okay. So if I were doing like a Dutch master, this would be a really good collar for that, because they had really large floppy collars. For a more contemporary look, you don't want that much of a collar. Okay. Take off a little here. Okay. Go. Bring that forward a bit. There we go. So that's looking better, right? Yeah, we're starting to get our piece there. Might make that a little smaller. Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's always better to start out with a bigger piece of clay, because then you can always take clay off. It's easier to do, I think, than to try to add clay to a small slab. I'm going to narrow the back of the collar there. There we go. Okay. Bring that down. Okay. So that fold is going to get flatter as it goes around the back of the neck there. So it's a little more popped out in the front because his collar is unbuttoned. So his collar is going to lay away from his neck area. Okay. There we go. Okay. So from there, I won't take you through the whole process, but I can do the same thing where I lay this out. I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to make a piece that's the same side but flipped over in mirror, so I can put another collar over there. And then last but not least, I will add the button placket.